Right, we're going to start. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the SOLA seminars. Today is the last seminar of semester 1. Thank you all for being here and for attending most of the lectures that we've had this semester, so yay! Today we have a special topic. We have the authors of the book called The Big Asian Book of Landscape Architecture. So this is Jackie's a copy of the book. So we'll circulate it around during the presentation for you guys to look at it. And we have Jillian Walliss and Heike Rahmann tuning in from Australia today. And we are very lucky to have them joining us on this special topic presentation. Thank you for coming. I'm gonna mute the microphone and the floor is yours.
Lovely, and I will turn off my camera, pardon me, for the presentation. Thank you, Nada, for the invitation and for everyone to come to our presentation today. It's a great pleasure talking to you about sort of the book itself and yeah, having the first opportunity in the Southern Hemisphere to have a live engagement about the book. In our presentation today, we'll share some of the insights from this book and we'll discuss what it means to design and do business in Asia. Over the past 2 years, Jillian and I have been working with many esteemed designers, with writers and thinkers, as well as with the new generation of academics and practitioners to explore trends and themes that influence landscape architecture practice and how to think about nature, space and urbanism with an Asian sensibility. So what or why are we as 2 Australian-based academics really writing and editing this book? As an Asian Pacific nation, Australia has very close economic and cultural relationships to Asia. And in recent decades, we have also seen a shift in the demographic makeup of the country. In 2017, for instance, immigration from Asian nations for the first time outnumbered immigration from English-speaking backgrounds. So Sydney and Melbourne, for example, are now considered Euro-Asian cities.
The PowerPoint's moving.
What? Sorry?
The presentation, it's not moving on my screen at the moment.
Oh, okay. So you still see the first slide. Okay. Then we have to do it this way. Does that work? Sorry. Does that work?
Not seeing anything yet. Okay,
now?
Yes.
And if I go full screen view, do you see this moving?
Yes.
Okay, so we were just about here talking about Sydney and Melbourne now being considered Euro-Asian cities. And this position has seeded really our interest in the region, which we have explored through previous research projects, through extensive travel and through personal engagement. So for me, for example, my personal engagement with Asia dates back to 2001 when I was working for Japanese architect Kisho Kurokawa. I consequently returned to Japan to pursue a PhD, which then develops into a long-term study on Japanese urbanism and led to the Tokyo Void publication with Melise Jonas. For the digital landscape book Jillian and I published in 2016, we have then developed a framework for working with practice and academia that is really valuable for the book, targeting equally professionals, students, and academics. The catalyst for this book here can be traced back to our experience editing the special themed edition in Landscape Architecture Australia titled Embracing the Asian Century, which we had the pleasure of working with Ricky Ray Ricardo in 2018, and started off with that kind of understanding of challenging the assumptions that we have about Asian practice and Asian engagement. In this edition, we looked at issues, topics, and trends that were relevant to Australian positions in the region in light of the repositioning of the global context towards Asia. So as we sort of see this as an Asian century right now. One of those fields in Australia that are heavily impacted by the trends and policy changes is the education sector, which has seen a significant rise in international student intake, certainly pre-COVID. It's going to be interesting how the trend will follow up past the next 2 years, if you like. And in this edition, we also featured students' perspective of international students sort of coming to Australia, understanding their experience, but also the background in relation to work and educational sort of environment in the Asian context. While we were also reviewing outstanding design projects in the Asian Pacific region that were recognized by the inaugural IFLA Asia Pacific Landscape Architecture Awards in 2017. Well, we have discovered exciting new projects that emerged in vastly different environments to that in Australia. We have also observed that in dominant landscape architecture publications, an engagement with Asia is noticeably absent. So this then raised the question to us, who really controls the discourse? And in that sort of work, we really saw that sort of non-Asian practices, if we at all talk about Asia, non-Asian practices working in Asia seem to dominate the discussion around architecture, landscape architecture and design. Sort of one of the examples that really shows this conundrum is the Solo 7017. The competition for this rebuild overpass leading from Seoul Station to the heart of the business district was awarded to Dutch architectural practice MVRDV. And as much as it is a radical move to close this road and reprogram it into a new public space in form of an extensive sky garden, it is also a massive branding project for the city. Due to the employment of an international star architect, the project received huge media coverage and for the competition. And in return, this generated large press exposure, obviously, for MVRDV. While this in itself is not an issue, it certainly has wider consequences on framing the discourse about the profession in different cultural contexts. So, for example, the project has been described as sole answer to New York's High Line, leading to the validation or contextualization of this project relative to Western knowledge. This is despite the fact that Seoul's own Cheonggyechong restoration project, which I'm aware all of you might know, actually precedes the High Line. In addition, the project's best aspect were actually designed or decided by local government designers and planners well before MVRDV even won the design competition. So we see here the elimination of the local voice and authorship from the project. These factors eventually negate discussions that contextualize the project in a South Korean lineage of urbanization. The issues are also evident in the on a pragmatic level, as design resolution have not really been highly praised in the construction. And further, in an article that was published in The Guardian in 2017, Winnie Maas, the director of MVRD, reflects on the Sky Garden idea, and I quote him here, that the garden will be human-friendly and green, in ways that might be thought typical of European city planning, but will also have a science fiction element that sort of Winnie Maas sort of saw in many Asian places. And he continues with further reflection that in Asia, they want to dip their cities in this super green feeling that comes from science fiction, from movies like Avatar. And he cites this in relation to Singapore's spectacular gardens by the bay. So what this then highlights to us is sort of that there are certain issues on a number of domains, really. One here is sort of that kind of Western interpretation of city planning principles, where you can say, look, this project has nothing to do with any of those ideas. But it also assumes Asia as both one in terms of aspiration, as well as in terms of climatic and zones from sort of ranging from the tropics in Singapore to temperate climate of Seoul. So for us, that then led to this question, what we really know about contemporary Asian landscape architecture. So from the outside of the region, the knowledge is sporadic, gleaned from project descriptions on website, or even the rare presentation at conferences. And within Asia, we have noted there has been a limited engagement that is complicated by the relative youth of the discipline, along with the fact that a collective notion of Asian identity is new as well. So with many designers and academics studying and training overseas, there is the tendency to look to international Western influence for validation and inspiration over peers. So that's not just a phenomena that we've seen sort of with Western designers coming into the Asian context, but it's also happening in Asia, in an inner Asia context. As a consequence, then, Asian knowledge is often conceived relative to North American and European perspectives, which can cloud what is particular or unique to landscape practice in the region. So in this context, we wanted to frame this book, and we were also very aware that based on our own ethics, we needed to extend our networks of or to Asian designers and academics, and that we wanted to hold a workshop, which we saw as a suitable format to allow that kind of extension of context and discussions to occur. The workshop we saw as a platform to establish the ambition for the publication, so to sharpen that up, to establish also the theoretical frameworks and directions for academic writings that we wanted to involve, and to eventually also define criteria for including design projects. So when we looked at the awards, particularly the Asia Pacific Awards now, there has been a number of projects that in a way were very hard to evaluate and judge due to the absence of precise criteria that were meaningful to that context. So we were very aware of that when we wanted to talk about projects, that we needed to have criteria that were sort of meaningful to the context. And obviously we saw the workshop also as a potential to generate the content through the group discussion. So then in 2018, we had a 20-minute chance encounter with Kon Jung Yu in Melbourne, really taking him out to a coffee with Jillian, sneaking in and getting that meeting actually to occur. And so we handed him the copy of the journal and declared our intention, which was basically stating that we wanted to challenge the Western dominant perspective of theories and saw that there was a huge potential in understanding Asian practice. And we also discussed with him our desire to run a workshop in Asia with that premise that we didn't have any funding. Konjang, you then generously offered us to host the 2-day workshop in Beijing, with the only exception that the participants would need to fund their own travel. So this was then planned for January 2019, and we set about to invite practitioner and academics from different Asian contexts. This is the list of practitioners, sort of both established and esteemed, as well as academics and a new generation of both academics and practitioners coming through. So we had a great spread from people attending from Thailand to Japan, from China to Singapore, and beyond. And the interesting thing is that some of the participants were not known to us, or they didn't know us. So traveling on this self-funded workshop, we thought was an incredibly generous leap of faith on their behalf. And probably that kind of motivation, the drive and the initiation sort of really led to the success of that workshop. We were really unaware of, at the time, that this workshop, the way that we planned it, was unfolding with a distinct Asian sensibility, if you like. So we offered really no framing beyond a few activities that we saw as catalyst for establishing the book major framings, and to initiate discussion and allow discussion to occur. And one of the activities, sort of as an icebreaker at the welcome dinner and at the first night, was to define Asia using this map here on the screen, which inspired endless debate and only highlighted that defining Asia is an impossibility. So that was for us a great way forward, sort of defining the boundaries of our discussion and an entry point into sort of what Jillian will talk about later on a little bit, this idea about Asia as method rather than talking about Asia as nations or geographic sort of field. In preparation for the workshop, each designer and academic was invited to prepare a short presentation discussing landscape architecture from their cultural perspective, and to nominate 3 influential contemporary Asian projects. For us, this was an important first potential pool of projects which we could draw from and which we could then expand. 2 of the projects we said could be from their own practice, and the third one should have been nominated from the region. And in this part was very interesting to see that many struggled to, or were hesitant to nominate the third project because they felt that they knew so little about their practices in the region, and sort of further highlighting what I mentioned beforehand, that kind of inter-Asian sort of knowledge somehow being not quite fully revealed. So eventually we had, I guess, 36 projects, which we then asked participants to discuss and to cluster without relying on typical classifications, such as the Western typologies or even size. And this was an interesting exercise. Sort of for us, this led to the conversation around what the criteria, or how to establish criteria for the project selection, but also it revealed interesting aspects of concepts and ideas that shape architecture, landscape architecture practice in the region. So for one, that was sort of an Asian sensibility about of space and nature. There was a discussion around authorship, and the third one was really about broader philosophical concepts that emerged and underpin with this long history, still contemporary design practice. On the second day, we then focused a little bit about on the exploration of diverse terminologies and concepts relating to the term landscape and what we do as in practice through different languages and mapping various lineages. So it became very clear that that term, the English term of landscape or landscape architecture was not very helpful, because that idea or this singular way of thinking and reading the landscape didn't exist, and there were multiple terms in different languages describing various nuances in the matter, subject matter. So what then also was became quickly apparent to us was also this opportunity that we generated with the workshop to create an environment where practitioners and academics could actually talk and exchange their ideas, and how rarely that kind of conversation happens. So conferences might be increasingly popular in Asia. However, these are normally only avenues to present ideas rather than to really discuss and go into the nitty-gritty grit of understanding sort of broader concepts and philosophies. The workshop also allowed us to engage with the lineage of designers, particularly in the Chinese context, and to see emerging practice of designers as an individual. So in the Chinese context, we have obviously prolific Continuum Yu, who might be one of the few designers for a long period of time who established a known name and a known practice that was recognized internationally, while designers otherwise, although we see great projects, are mostly hidden inside these massive design institutes, which are tied to universities and thus government. So we had Dong Zhang and Huiqing Zong from Z&T and Lab Design and Hope there, who really are the next generation of designers, sort of all under the lineage and being educated and tied back somehow to Continuum Yu, who then sort of were able to reflect on their own individual positions and develop an individual practice as part of that. In this context of this shared environment in a way as well, it was interesting to see how the designers then also opened up about expressions or experiences and reflections on sort of other occasion, talking about them as Asian practitioners or academics in this sort of international context. For instance, Dong reflected on an experience that he had in Harvard, where James Corner was talking about sort of origin of water management and water landscapes, and it was a very American-centric perspectives, and that somehow sort of brings it all back in this discussion about the lineage, sort of dating back to Law Olmsted. And in a way, he felt that there was this alternative story sort of coming from the long sort of history of water engagements, water landscapes in the Asian and Chinese context, but didn't feel in the position at that time to say anything and to challenge that perception. Sort of one thing was sort of language insecurity probably at that time, which you said, but also this kind of idea of feeling slightly inferior in framing and addressing and engaging in the discussion that way. So that kind of position of practitioners and academics in that context is a relatively important aspect that will be part, or was part of the a result of this conversation, but it's also part of our motivation to give agency, if you like, to practitioners and academics in the region to formulate their position. So for us, this was really an interesting sort of aspect where we saw incredible trust sort of established in that workshop, where we could share experiences, and really participants were absolutely happy and very vigorous in sharing, which was sometimes in a classroom environment we might be seeing that there is sort of that hesitancy that even Dong reflected on as well. So that was quite positive for us, because we felt that we were really digging into bigger sort of themes that were authentic, rather than us sort of dominating the discussion. And in a surprising conclusion then of the two-day workshops, many participants also stated that before the workshop they did not see themselves as Asian designers, but now they were proud. So Hui Cheng sort of said that in particular, I was like, oh yeah, now I feel proud to be Asian and a practitioner in that context. So we left the workshop with still no clear book structure, and what we gained, however, in return was a far more sort of valuable commodity, which was these relationships and the deeper discussions. So hopping on the high-speed train from Beijing back to Hong Kong, we spent the next 10 hours establishing the book's ambition and the scope, coming fresh from our discussions and the notes of the workshop. We also previously had discussions about the book and the ambition with the then president of IFLA Asia Pacific, Damien Tang, in Singapore, as we were really very aware of the politics, especially around China. And based on his advice, we have framed the discussion around economic zones, not nations, which allowed us then to talk about policies and politics without actually talking about politics. Coming from that workshop then with the initial framings and with a clearer perspective of what we were looking for in the design projects, we then set out or developed the project calls, which we have published in English and then translated into Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and my favorite, Thai. These were then also distributed with Damien's help via the national chapters in the region. We have received, I guess, over 150 projects, out of which sort of 80 made it into the book. And I guess we could see with that we started to produce the book, or have produced a book in an Asian speed, or at an Asian speed, from sort of the first conceptualization coming off the Landscape Architecture Australia journal in 2018 to the actual publication in 2020. Interestingly, in the way that we have worked, sort of the writing, editing, and the design of the book almost happened simultaneously due to the complexity of it. So that's a very unusual way of book production, which normally sort of has a full manuscript sent even before securing a contract. Now in our way, this was the Asian speed, and as part of that is sort of developing the project concurrently. I will now hand over to Jillian, who will discuss the framing of the content a little bit more in detail.
Thank you, Heike. So guided by the framing of Asia as method, we aim to document an emerging, diverse and adventurous contemporary landscape practice post-2000. So what do we mean by Asia as method? In a 1960 lecture, Japanese philosopher Yoshimi Takeuchi advocated breaking from binary framing such as progress and tradition or the East and West. Agonising over Japan's role during World War II, he argued that it was unproductive to turn to Europe or North America for explanations of why Japanese history had gone astray. While Asia's intellectual elite, in their pursuit of modernisation, tried to emulate the West, Takeuchi reflected on the hierarchical relationship between the West and Asia, resulting from different stages of modernisation. He observed that if one went to Europe or the United States, there would be a sense that the people there are superior to or better than oneself. Instead, he suggested interreferencing places that share similar historical experiences to produce grounded knowledge. This idea of interreferencing, also known as Asia as method, offers a concrete intellectual agenda that, and I'm quoting, enables research to be placed in its specific historical context without the epistemological and ontological burden of catching up with the West. Takeuchi argues that Asianism is not an objective concept or one that can be narrativized into a single trend of thought organized around an innate cultural essence. Instead, he describes Asianism as a mood or an inclination. So reflecting on the Beijing workshop and the concept of Asia as method, we adopted a tripartite structure of continuum, interruption and speed for our book. We view these as critical characteristics or moods for building a picture of what it means to design, do business and think about nature, space and urbanism with an Asian sensibility. There is no hierarchy to these three characteristics which simultaneously influence an Asian practice. Hence, our readers can start with any section. Continuum establishes some of the shared cultural and philosophical understandings of space, time and nature that cross the Asian region and explores how these are interpreted within contemporary design practice. While the discipline of landscape architecture is new in Asia, this knowledge is centuries old. Interruption explores the impact of modernity and economic growth on Asia. Urbanisation, shaped by complex relationships between government, developers, international and local investment and citizens, underpins the introduction of new open space typologies, along with the emergence of landscape architecture as a discipline. Speed examines how governments and designers respond to the boom-bust cycles of economic development, the imbalance of rural and urban processes and the density of the Asian city. Rather than viewed as a hindrance, speed can be considered a mechanism for innovation and change, acting as a catalyst for fast and slow design practice as Asian societies transition into a new phase of development. So each of these sections begins with a major positioning essay, which introduces framings and ideas emerging from Asian scholarship relevant to landscape architecture. These essays, written by Heike and myself, provide theoretical, cultural and political contextualization for the more focused academic writing, shorter reflections, practice interviews and design projects interwoven throughout each section. A major aim was to merge academic writing, design projects and critical reflection in a dynamic way that would appeal to the widest audience. We endeavoured to introduce concepts in the original language and offer detailed English translation. There are too many languages to consider dual translation, not to mention the cost of doing this. And we also wanted the book's content to reach the widest audience, hence why it was written in English. Now, rather than describe the book's content in detail, I'm going to highlight some key concepts with an audience not based in Asia might appreciate from reading the book. So we'll start with Continuum. So this is broken into two sections. Artificial nature focuses on the significance of water in the Asian context. discussing its historical and cultural significance and showcasing contemporary projects. This discussion would offer the most familiar content to an international audience. Scaling Up and Down explores the use of deep form and cultural patterns in contemporary design work. A major feature are the 3 critical reflections from leading design practices in Korea, China, and Japan. Here we start to see how shared cultural and philosophical ideas from what are defined as the bamboo civilizations are interpreted in different urban contexts. For example, all acknowledge the importance of relationships between the mountain and water, and in their own words, they discuss how they adapt their rich cultural legacy into contemporary design approaches. This is particularly evident in Park Kim's essay, which discusses how to bring back the spirit of Sansu culture into the Korean city. Chinese practice Z and T reflect on how China's long history of garden making with its many symbols and miniature landscapes inform their contemporary practice, which incorporates an artist studio in their Shanghai office. Japanese practice Earthscape highlight how philosophy and Shintoism are embedded in their precise, artful practice. This is clearly demonstrated in Karasansui Park, which reinterprets a dry garden for motorbike parking. Bringing these 3 voices together demonstrates the value of interreferencing, challenging the idea of nationalistic styles to instead focus on flows of knowledge and shared concepts. This critical reflection also dismantles the reductive binary of traditional and modern, which fails to acknowledge enduring cultural knowledge. If we turn to Interruption, this section focuses on the influence of modernisation, modernity, and economic prosperity in the shaping of the new discipline of landscape architecture. This section highlights the impossibility of understanding the emergence of new urban open space in Asian cities through Western typologies of public and private. It's structured into 3 parts. Repositioning the private realm introduces the role that developers play in constructing a new urban realm of hybrid mixed-use typologies appropriate for the dense Asian city. In many cases, developers are operating as stronger community builders than government. Ensembles highlights the emergence of new design models which engage directly with the community and discusses how these practices reflect a transition towards more civic-orientated societies. While Transformative Forces discusses how unpredictable natural disasters of earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, flooding and volcanoes introduce powerful influences outside of the control of the nation state. The essays and projects demonstrate the diversity of agents and practices involved in the production of Asian urban space. This is far more complex and dynamic than overused generalizations such as top-down or bottom-up, and also builds a picture of how doing business in Asia is distinctive from other global contexts. For example, the major Asian shopping mall developer CapitaLand redeveloped the IT-focused Funan shopping mall in Singapore into an innovative downtown hub, mixing co-housing and co-living, entertainment, workspaces, retail and leisure. Funan offers a new interpretation of the civic. A bike path cuts right through the ground floor, while the roof features Singapore's largest urban garden. Neonbashi Garden on the top of Mitsukoshi department store introduces a peaceful contemporary stroll garden into the heart of Tokyo. A large open roof structure offers people a sheltered space to relax and enjoy the rooftop views. Similarly, Korean airline Air Busan provides a generous rooftop escape for workers at their headquarters. While in Guangzhou, the Vanka Group encouraged landscape architects Lab D&H to incorporate an extensive playscape into a commercial plaza. These 4 projects demonstrate the role that business is playing in introducing high-quality open space into dense Asian cities. They also set more ambitious benchmarks for how we might consider mixed-use developments in Australia and New Zealand. These projects challenge Western ideas of public space, and it's important to not use Western values to critique these projects. Instead, discussions need to be grounded in political, cultural, and economic specifics. For example, Japanese academic Akiko Akabe's contributes an essay which discusses how culturally problematic the term public is within the Japanese context. Another highlight is Jeff Howe's essay, Emerging Spaces of Citizenship, which introduces the diverse ensembles of actors, including citizens, civil society groups, professionals, the private sector, universities and government institutions in developing citizen-driven placemaking in East Asia. Featured projects include the Park Up site, driven by Taipei's first co-working space, the Magic Carpet, which was a collaboration between Chinese University of Hong Kong and local communities, insertions into the informal settlement of Treasure Hill in Taipei, and the Clover Nature School collaboration program in Shanghai. Together, these discussions build a picture of an Asian urbanism where open space forms part of a complex social, economic, and political transformations which defy the reductiveness of Western landscape typologies. Whereas Interruption focused on urban conditions, the final section, Speed, widens discussions to include the urban-rural relationship and broadens understanding of green infrastructure to highlight their intertwined social value. There are three parts. Fast and Slow discusses how these two speeds of growth and decline can offer equally valuable outcomes for developing landscape practice. For example, China's declaration as an ecological civilization after decades of growth has established it as a global laboratory for ecological design. In contrast, Japan's economic slowdown and aging population has encouraged a slow ecology which equally incorporates cultural and ecological practice. Landscapes in the Sky focuses on the integration of green infrastructure into dense urban form, with a particular focus on Singapore with its strong government policy and developer incentives. Importantly, these projects are as much about social infrastructure as ecological outcome. And Retreat discusses how the desire for respite from the hectic Asian city has produced restorative landscapes ranging from immersive resort experiences through to forest bathing. Now, this section, Speed, incorporates the most designed projects in the book. For example, folded into the Fast-Slow section are the more rural-focused projects or experiential installations. For example, the Rice Gardens temporary design interventions work with harvesting methods and local construction techniques to provide spaces for culture, education, and art activities. These projects are as much about reconnecting the Chinese urban population with rural practices as empowering rural communities. The social enterprise project Medical Herbman travels to teach people the value and use of herbs through a planted herb garden and cafe. Yellowhorn Farm Park in Inner Mongolia celebrates the environmental rehabilitation of the Mongolian plateau, while Roof Sentiment, a temporary installation on the courtyard of Seoul's National Museum of Contemporary Art, works with the traditional hanok roof form of Korean architecture to develop a new tactile and spatial experience. The Landscape in the Sky section showcases many of the extraordinary urban projects encouraged by the Singaporean government. For example, Kampong Admiralty draws on the self-sufficiency of traditional Kampong villages to interweave aged housing, childcare, medical centres, outdoor recreation, green infrastructure, and urban gardens. These Singapore projects have proven influential in the broader Southeast Asian region. For example, the extensive infrastructure projects appearing in Bangkok, such as Thammasat University Green Roof. The final section, Retreat, features landscapes driven by the desire to escape the speed of the city. For example, the Okatama Forest Therapy Trail was designed for therapeutic effect. Careful design transforms the mountainous landscape of an abandoned conifer forest into an accessible and unique experience for the elderly. The Hoshinoya resorts, constructed across Japan, Indonesia, and Taiwan, aspire to reveal the hidden characteristics and cultural experience in each location. And we conclude the book with a particularly revealing interview with Huyen Chang from the Singaporean-based practice salad dressing. He discusses how he folds philosophical explorations of time, meaning, and the natural world into his fast-paced commercial practice, which is located in the grandstand of a redundant Singaporean racecourse. The projects and writing featured in Speed are therefore conceived in the context of slow and fast design practice and have emerged in direct response to the processes of urbanisation discussed as part of Interruption. Many of these ideas draw on cultural practices and philosophies introduced in Continuum, while others work at the edge of new technologies and materiality. Rather than viewed as a hindrance to design, Speed can be considered as a mechanism for innovation and change, acting as a catalyst for new design practice as Asian societies transition into the next phase of economic development. I'm now going to hand back to Heike, who will discuss the importance of graphic design in developing the book.
As Jillian mentioned already, for us it was important that the development of the book was reflecting this non-linear fashion, so that the readers had the opportunity to dig into the content at any stage. And this included a quite complex hierarchy between different essay types, the presentation of projects, which ranged from separate project catalogues to full integration into essays. The positioning of projects and the essays was a really dynamic, pardon me, a really dynamic process, as I mentioned earlier, and was still going on while we have started the graphic design. So one of the most important aspects at the start was to get this hierarchy right, so that the reader would not lose orientation in this maze of projects and essays and ideas. At the beginning, this mainly focused on graphic design features, which eventually became much richer and nuanced, including us working out a matrix for how and where each essay would have to start. Miraculously, this also allowed us to, after the first typesetting, to stay within the contracted page numbers. It was also important that the tripartite would be reflected in the graphic design. Interruption was in the easiest sort of section to work with. So this kind of Asian quirkiness and the idea of interruption was for the graphic designer easily understood and translated into this magnificent work, while Continuum proved to be the most challenging, where we needed to navigate the initial cultural misinterpretation, sort of focusing on pattern and colors, to then later navigating sort of the Scandinavian design to in fact actually achieve a more Zen-like or Muji-like design that was reflective of the concepts we talked about in Continuum. We also had to control the graphic design in a way that allowed the images to be foregrounded. So despite all the noise and the quirkiness, the importance was still sorry. The importance was still to be legible. This also was a big discussion regarding the title and the cover design, which eventually was coming out of a very last-minute proposal, coming out of the series of propositions. I think we have settled on this first option here at the top before, and sort of decided that sort of we had to navigate somehow while being catchy, had to navigate also sort of that kind of political view of the red being sort of associated with communist and so on, and therefore preferencing certain parts of the region over others. So in sort of the suite of propositions, really at the last round when we were already signing off on the cover, the graphic designer sort of had this pink option sort of sneaked into the suite, and I think it was a last minute decision to go back to that and review. So we had a little bit of call among our peers and colleagues, sort of asking sort of preferences. It was really interesting seeing that this idea of the cuteness or the playfulness that is embedded in this pink structure was sort of really working quite well for what we wanted to achieve with the book itself as well. And with that is also the idea of interweaving the different linguistic intricacies into the book cover as well, where the flaps sort of include sort of a grouping of the terms that we have discussed and explored during the workshop. So to conclude, where does this journey leave us and where do we go from here? I think the book really offers a different lens on the profession and different ways of how to engage in context in these vastly different cultures and languages. So for us, for Jillian and me, the book has already become an incredibly helpful tool to change our teaching. There's now a greater understanding and confidence in discussing Asia with students, cultural, sort of in relation to cultural concepts, in relation to precedents, and to position the student projects in the canon of a Asian landscape architecture, both in terms of design studios as well as in theoretical subjects. And the interesting thing there is to observe that it is both that engagement with international students as well as the real interest from domestic students to learn about something they had no idea about, sort of really that kind of novel exploration. Jillian, do you want to chime in on that? And
yeah, I mean, I think in the course of doing this book, I've restructured my entire contemporary landscape theory course, and it has just allowed us to introduce so many different ways of talking about and thinking about landscape architecture. So it's really freshened up the idea of what is landscape discourse, where, you know, I can put landscape urbanism and get that over and done with in the first couple of weeks, and then move into a lot of really new ways of thinking. And it also, I think, has challenges us as academics who are writing in English, just how sloppy and inaccurate English is in thinking about, you know, we're still so bounded by these ideas of nature and culture, traditional, modern, East and West. And I think the entire experience has really broken that down and, yeah, just really opened up new ways of thinking about what's going on, and also revealing all this amazing work that is completely hidden in an international context, because those who have English control the discourse. I think it also, I mean, the reason why Heike's got this up as well, the IFLA regions, I think particularly for Australia and New Zealand, obviously we're sitting in IFLA Asia Pacific, and I think, you know, our book should be helpful in us understanding the difference of what's going on. I think the IFLA regions are quite often seen as trying to empower the region, but I'm not so sure that, you know, they're highly political on who is actually controlling the discourse in these IFLA regions as well. And I think from the Australian New Zealand perspective, this is really important. We are being positioned geographically here. Australia has strong cultural and economic connections with Asia, and it's been an elephant in the room. Like, we really haven't adapted what we've done beyond the European, North American foundational stories. Australia and New Zealand, we've opened up our discourse because we've been dealing with the ramifications of colonisation. So in terms of understanding Maori sort of Indigenous complexities, but I think we're in a good position now to take this further and engage with Asia in a sophisticated way that we've been able to do, New Zealand better than Australia, with Indigenous people.
Okay, so this concludes our presentation, and we are happy to take on questions and have a good conversation.
Thank you both for a great presentation.